So I'm here today with John Jeans. As always, a brilliant public sector servant. I'm really excited to interview him. We have spoken before, and I know he's going to have lots of exciting things for us to share. The essence of these sessions is always to pick the brains of some brilliant people that have had amazing careers so that we can learn from their mistakes, we can pick up tips and basically take it forward in our public sector journeys. So I will kick off by asking John if he can give us his 60-second overview of his career to date, and then we'll get into the questions. But before we do that, just to give you that little bit of thinking time, John, you're the person in my background screen on the hammock. So I kick off with, what's your favourite drink? There's some drinks just behind me there, look. What drink are you going to be drinking whilst we go through this process?
So if we were doing this on a sort of Friday evening, and I was truly in a hammock somewhere in where it was warm and sunny, it would probably be a Flor de Caña, which is a type of Nicaraguan rum. I spent several years as a medical student in Nicaragua in the summers doing some charity work, and it's remains my favorite rum that I've ever had. So that's where it would be in an ideal world.
That sounds good. Yeah. That sounds good. Can you get it in Sainsbury's?
You can actually get it in this country now. You couldn't for donkey's years, but you can now actually get it off of Amazon. But the reality is that I would be very unlikely to do that because I have a third child on the way next week. And so I'll be lucky to get an orange juice before passing out at about 8:30 is probably going to be the outcome for the next couple of months. But anyhow.
Okay, well, that's given us a nice picture. I might even try and hunt some of that out for the weekend. So thanks again for giving us your time. I know it's precious, especially given what you've just said. So I really appreciate it. So let's kick off then with your 60-second overview, just to give us a frame.
So 60 seconds of my career to date. I had a relatively, my career, I guess, probably started at medical school. I did some bits and bobs and odd jobs before then, but it really kind of kicked off at medical school when I went to Imperial, and did a good medical degree at Imperial, worked as a healthcare assistant and did some charity work in the interim. So I worked as a healthcare assistant through most of my medical degree, which I found really helpful, actually. I think my personal belief is that if you're going to go into healthcare in any way, shape or form, working as care assistant is really, really useful because you understand a lot of what people actually want and what people actually sort of need when their health is not what they would ideally want it to be. I really enjoyed within my time at medical school, doing some charity work, and that was out in Central America. So for a couple of summers, I spent some time in Nicaragua doing some charity work out there, and then finished off medical school. Did a range of different medical jobs, everything from general surgery, general medicine, intensive care. Did a bit of cardiothoracic surgery, which I learned a lot from doing. That was a very interesting 6 months. And then went and did some A&E for 6 months as well, which was helpful. And then decided to become an anaesthetist and did my SHO training in anesthesia. And then right at the end of my SHO training, my dad became a patient and ended up passing away. And that experience of his diagnosis with gastric cancer and then a subsequent palliation was, he didn't get the kind of care that we would want our colleagues, patients, friends, family to have. So after his death, I then took about a year and a half out of clinical practice, got involved in, of all things, a workforce modeling program where I learned loads about data, but also how without data is great, but it's about what you do with that data and how you have conversations with data. That's what helps you change the way that we deliver care using new care and new workforce models. And after doing that work for about 18 months, I've been part-time clinically for the last 10 years. And what started off as sort of an interest in being in trying to use data to help people change the way they deliver clinical care turned into something more about 5 or 6 years ago when I started to do some national work with HE at the time, creating a program to train clinicians to use a combination of big data analysis and new workforce models, new modeling techniques to redesign models of care and workforce to improve patient care and outcomes. And I've been doing that alongside my clinical work in anesthesia for the last 6-7 years now. And so currently work as a consultant anaesthetist at the RNOH. And when I'm not anaesthetising, lead the CLEAR program nationally, or the clinical led workforce activity redesign program nationally, and also do that through my own business, which is called FittoCare, which is an SME. So yeah.
And that was 33N.
It was, yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just to make it clear for anybody that wants to go and do a Google search.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. It's much better that you ignored the 60 seconds because we've got a much richer feel for that now, which is excellent. So I always ask this question. I think it's a nice starting point, and I'm starting to glean some similarities as well from all these different people from different sectors of the public sector. Was there anything in your childhood that sort of led you to be a public servant, do you think?
So I think my mum worked for the district attorney's office in New York. So she was the first female ADA in the Southern District of New York in the late 70s, early 80s. And so I actually was born in the States and lived there for quite a few years of my childhood up until the age of 10 when we finally moved to this country. And my dad was a film producer for the BBC. And
wow, interesting parents.
Yeah, they were interesting dynamic group, dynamic duo, I suppose. And I think they were, those two jobs are quite public servant jobs.
Yeah.
Where my mum saw a lot of and dealt with a lot of really tough stuff when she was district attorney in the States. And then this is sort of New York in the 70s and 80s. It's a far cry from
really
the
tough.
city as it is now. Yeah, very tough environment. And my dad spent a lot of time making documentaries and trying to sort of show the world as it was. Again, across both in the US, well, in several different continents, as well as working in this country. And I think through watching the way they worked and the values that they lived, it became clear to me that you could gain a lot of joy and satisfaction from working in the public sector, and that you could do a lot of good for a lot of people. And that was sort of what drove me to. I mean, to be honest, the reason I became a doctor was I didn't really think about it that much. If I'm really honest, I wanted to be a train driver until I was 12, and then sort of said, "Oh well, I should probably do something else." I was like, "Oh, I'll be a doctor," and I think actually not knowing what being a doctor meant was really quite helpful, because you don't know what being a doctor means until you get to probably, I think, 5 years after medical school. You start to get a bit of a feel for what it actually means. And being a doctor by its very nature is inherently being a public servant, or in my view of what being a doctor is inherently by being a public servant. And so I think what drove me towards the career, I didn't really think about it that much, but what I did think about was, or what I did see in my life up to that point where I went to medical school, was living the values of service, dedication, hard work, to some significant element sometimes of self-sacrifice, but doing so because to support society. And I think that's a really, for me personally in my work that I do, it doesn't matter what hat I have on, I'm really keen to support society so that we can all live the best lives that we can.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. I think it's a small sample size, but everybody so far has had some family connection to public service, which it is interesting. It is. So What so far have been the key impacts or moments in your career that have really shaped you and made you almost change direction or have some sort of eureka moment so far?
I suppose the first and the most sort of obvious one is my dad's diagnosis and death. I think
Yeah.
that made a huge impact on the way that on my career. So I was very much, a normal anesthetist, whatever that means, right?
Mm.
Prior to my dad's illness, and in 2012, he got basically he became dysphagic, so he had trouble swallowing, and he went to the GP, and after a couple of trips to the GP, I was a little bit worried because I didn't think that he was flowing fast enough through the system. And so what I ended up doing was asking a colleague at the trust that I was working at the time, Imperial, if he would just go have a look at my dad. And so John Martin, who's the gastroenterologist who I asked, said, "Yeah, sure, just bring him down. I'll have a look at him after clinic one day." And he came down and had a chat with my dad, and within the next 48 hours, he was having an endoscopy, and that endoscopy sadly showed a gastric cancer, or a tumor at the gastroesophageal junction. And what I then saw was the NHS at its absolute best. So within 48 hours after that, my dad had a CT, chest abdo pelvis, a PET CT, and he had been referred to a MDT, where there was a gentleman who was still practicing at the time, a surgeon, Prof. George Hanna, who at that time in London was getting 50%, so that's 50,
Mm.
5-year survival outcomes from the operations that he was doing on his patients, taking on patients that were more complicated and difficult that other people wouldn't operate on. And so my dad had the fortune to be able to go to see Prof. And if he'd gone to his local trust down the road in North London, he would have had a 15 or 15% 5-year survival rate. So it's an absolute difference in survival of 35%.
Yeah, absolutely. And would there have been a risk of them saying, "Well, we're not even going to do it"?
Yeah. Because he was a 2B, sort of cancer. He had a tumor that hadn't eroded through the stomach, but had gone through the inner layers, and he had a couple of lymph nodes, some that were a little bit further away than you'd like them to be, but it was still, in the brackets of curable surgery, with some neoadjuvant, with some chemotherapy before the operation. So my dad ended up having a couple of rounds of chemotherapy, and even though he's been treated in the trust where I was working, he had one time he got neutropenic sepsis and didn't get antibiotics for about 24 hours. And it was interesting because the gold standard is antibiotics within ideally 1, but within 6 hours you should be having IV antibiotics if you've got neutropenic sepsis and you had to wait 24. And that was because the system wasn't working around him. And then he stopped having his chemo, and he needed to have an operation, and he got cancelled 3 times. No, he got cancelled twice because there weren't enough ITU beds, which I get. We've got pressure on ITU beds, and he got cancelled week 1, he cancelled week 2, and then he got an operation on the 3rd week. And he had a very good operation, but then he got out of the hospital 10 days later, which is great for the type of surgery. I had a big operation to remove these tumors. But 6 months after that, he got an early recurrence, and he was taken back into hospital with painless jaundice, and the scans showed that there was nothing that could be done for him at that time. And what ended up happening is that he wanted to die at home. That was his desire. So what we ended up doing was having to self-discharge him from hospital because the community services couldn't be put in place fast enough for him to potentially die at home. We brought him home, but we were assured, "Don't worry, we'll get everything set up. People will be around. It'll be okay." And the very next day, we got a syringe driver, so basically a piece of kit to inject painkiller medications in, but no drugs, and no one to help us set it up. So we had to get the out of hours GP to come around. He came around with some meds, and not meds. He came around, wrote us a prescription. We then took the prescription off to the out of hours pharmacy. Came back with a bunch of vials of different end of life drugs. And my wife, who's another anaesthetist, and I, we set up a little prescription chart, and we kept a log of all the different controlled drugs that we would need to give. And we called up the hospice, and we said, what do we do? They said, don't worry, draw up these drugs in this way and call us back if you have any problems. Call us every 12 hours, we'll help. And so we did that, and we did that every single day for the next week. And after that week, my dad died. And 2 days after my dad died, the community palliative care team came around and said, is there anything we can do to help? And I walked away from that very much on the path to becoming a grumpy colleague, because I felt let down by the service and the system. But I didn't want to be that guy. I wanted to try and be someone who had a positive impact, because that's who my dad was. And so that caused me to stop being just a normal anaesthetist and start to do the transformation work and the work that we do with AI and all these other interesting, and meet a whole bunch of very, very different and fascinating people, to try and not accept the world for as it was for me at that time, but support people to make the world a place which is where people get better care and better outcomes.
Yeah, that's a powerful story. It makes me feel like he's lucky to have you and your wife. Probably made a massive difference.
I hope, you know, I mean, he was lucky to have my wife, you know, my mum, all my family, his friends. He was, you know, a very happy-go-lucky guy. So, so yeah, I mean, you do what you can, right? We all do what we can for our family when we can. But what the reflection I have on it is that I had to get really involved. I didn't want to be involved. I wanted to be a son. I didn't want to have to be a doctor or such a prominent advocate for him throughout his illness. So, you know, hopefully the work that we do with the healthcare transformation will.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it feels like that was the harder edge of you realizing that all these silos that exist in the NHS are not connected well enough, and there isn't that flow of information and thought around making it all seamless and work properly.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I'm sure there's patients every day that run up with the same barriers that my dad ran up against, and hopefully, it always feels. I was speaking to a medical director of an ICB recently, and he said, it always feels like you're not making enough progress and you need to do more. But then when you take a step back and you think about how things were 10 years ago, things actually tend to have improved in some way, shape, or form. Not always, you know, there's waiting lists have got higher. You know, there's, you know, we could argue that we're not delivering as much care with the same staff as we were pre-COVID. There's all sorts of things that aren't working as well as we would like them to. But you can look at other things and you say, I actually have in my trust, I can go on to a portal right now. And if the patient's from London, I can see every single healthcare interaction that they've had. Not everyone, but the majority of the healthcare interactions they have. So that joined upness is starting to improve.
Yeah.
But there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, fascinating. So I guess then if we move forward then from your dad's experience and what you've been doing since then, I guess we could summarize to say you've been a lot more proactive, you've been a lot more progressive in terms of wanting to make a difference and searching out change and such like. What do you see as the biggest challenges now then, and what are you working on now?
The biggest challenges now. So I was asked a similar question actually at a conference recently, is what one thing would you change if you wanted to try and have a difference now? And there's loads of things, right? You know, there was a conversation that followed off the back of this, is, oh, well, you know, it'd be really helpful if we could class deploy new technology as revenue, but not coming from a capital budget, because currently it comes from capital, not from revenue, and you know, it's makes it far more difficult to get things procured and moving in the NHS. So you can go down quite technical things that could potentially make a difference. I think for me, I'd like to think a bit broader than that. So what is the one thing that we could all do differently? And that would be to think about the mindset that we approach the way that we deliver our roles within health and care settings. And if we all were able to be just a little bit more effective with our mindset. That's quite I choose that word quite consciously, because effective mindsets are different for different roles. So, you could argue that in my role as an anaesthetist, an effective mindset is to be sympathetic and compassionate with my patients all the time. But that when I'm dealing with an emergency, an effective mindset is to be quite, forthright and firm in terms of trying to sort out the issues with the emergency. So it's different mindsets are needed for different roles. But if we could all look at the roles that we're in at a given moment and think about the mindset that we are approaching that role in, and try and have the right mindset for that role at that time, the benefits that we can give each other are actually quite profound. And I link that back to a friend of mine who used to be part of the Olympic cycling team. And he has this one quote for me that always sort of like stood up very strongly. He said, "There's lots of marginal gains that you can make in the physical sort of like in the training that you give Olympic athletes." He said, "But if you can get the mindset into the right mindset, that can far surpass any of the gains that you've got with your marginal gains elsewhere." He said it can suck them all away, or it can enhance them by a significant percentage, by a much higher impact than he said you can. His words were, "You can get marginal gains, a percentage here, a percentage there, a percentage there, but if you get the mindset right, that can give you a further 20% on top of all of that." And I think he was exaggerating to prove the point, but the key is that mindset matters everywhere. And the more that we think and consciously engage with having the right mindset in the right interactions in our roles, the value that we can bring to each other and to our patients is quite profound.
Okay, so can I test this? So the book that I've just written, these points are all in my head really strongly. I just want to check to see if we're aligned. I think we are, but I want to check. So I make the case in the book that I think we've fallen into a trap in the West of believing that scientific management and control and command management is the most efficient way to manage. And that effectively leads us into silos. So we each become experts in our little siloed areas. I'm shortcutting this very quickly just to get through the question, but that eventually leads to us being more interested in our set of tick box KPIs than actually the patient themselves. So I think we can in that environment, we can easily lose track of the patient. So if I was just to give a bit of a flippant example, if a GP knows they've got 30 patients to see today, the 30 patients becomes the most focused salient factor. And they can end up, without even knowing it, they can end up rushing through those 30 patients to tick all 30 off. But actually, I was a case in kind. If it had spent an extra 5 minutes with me in my diagnosis, I would have missed 18 months of going through irrelevant secondary care referrals. So I think it's so easy for us to get into silos where we lose track of actually what are we here for? And I think that ties in with your mindset. And the other thing I would tie into this is, spoke to 20 nurses throughout the book, and there was a real feel of it. Because again, it's linked to the command and control. Top-down management is a set of dictates and tick boxes and checklists, which aren't in themselves a bad thing, but if they're used inappropriately, which almost ties in with you again, they can become a bad thing because you lose the mental agility, and all those skills and experience become lost, and you almost become a computer says no type human being because you're governed by all these sets of rules, and you lose all those amazing skills and those insights and that ability to adapt because the situation's different there than it is there. So that for me feels really close, but I don't know if this is tying in with your view of the answer to the question that you made, or are we different?
No, I mean, I think it's when I think about managerial styles, I always think about what is the problem we're trying to solve. And you'll need different managerial styles to solve different types of problems.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you're leading a platoon of soldiers to war in a battlefield, that is a very different management style to trying to get children to play football in the park. You know, it's a totally different style of leadership and management. And the tendency that we have to try and measure and use metrics. There's nothing wrong with using measures and metrics to help organize a system, but it's choosing the what and how of those measures and metric to be to the fore. Using those right measures and metrics is absolutely critical. And to choose which measures and metrics to use, you really have to understand the problem.
Yeah.
And so what I mean by that, and the problem is generally, what is the patient and societal pathology that we are seeing? And then how do we care for those patients? And then how do we measure the care for those patients in an appropriate manner? So to take your thesis and to expand on it, you could argue that we should be measuring productivity to every single interaction that a clinician has with a patient all the way through a patient journey. However, if we want to move, as has recently been said from in the Darcy report, from treatment to prevention, what we know is that the metrics for productivity, as they're set out, very much favour we don't measure prevention particularly well. We don't have the right metrics for it. We don't have the right measures. So if we take the same approach and apply that to care as we know it, you'll make it very difficult to deliver a preventative care model, because you shouldn't be measuring activity in the same way. I also think that there's a desire to control, and to try and there's a desire not to delegate authority. But what we know in high-performing teams is that, you know, it's this sort of foundation. You need to have trust within that team, and then out of trust, you can have open conversations, and then, but you know, as you move up the pyramid, you basically are able to hold people to account in a constructive and supportive manner. And what we know in that for managing teams and teams of teams, that delegation of authority and passing accountability down is really important in a structured manner. So going back to your point of if we are over managing through metrics throughout the NHS, I don't think there's anyone that would disagree with that. The question is, what are the right ways to support colleagues to deliver the best care, and how do we measure that in a way that's constructive and doesn't lead to lots of spreadsheets being sent around all over the NHS, so that to monitor it, which distracts people from actually doing the key things, which is creating supportive environments, and appropriate behaviours within teams to help people deliver care well.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it's getting, and you've alluded to this as well, it's getting close to the work. So your work experience when you were studying is just massively powerful. You start to understand. You can't really understand until you're there in the thick of it, actually doing the work. In the book, I talk about 4 layers of knowledge. Academic knowledge is just one of 4, and you need all 4 to really have wisdom, really. And getting close and hands-on to the work is absolutely critical. And I think then, again, back to the trust point, as a nurse, because I've done a lot with the nurses with this, if you've got the training, you've got the experience, you can read different situations and different scenarios and apply the appropriate work and the appropriate decision-making processes. But actually, if it's too much of a command and control and you've got quite limited, narrow check boxes, in the book, I give an example similar to your dad, of nurse's dad, poor care, poor treatment, and inappropriate decisions being made because those check boxes are too narrow and too simplistic. And she gives me a great example of why that is. So I think those things are at play. And I think it's that element of nurses. I think nurses are the foundation of change in the NHS, because they're the foundation, because they're so close to the patient. and they've got a lot of amazing skills, so they don't need to escalate to medical treatment the whole time. Another example in the book was checklist might say that hit a certain temperature, you need to get the doctors involved because it's probably an infection and we need antibiotics. And the nurse will say, well, hang on a minute, patient's got 18 blankets on them, this room is roasting hot, the window needs to be open, they've not drunk anything for hours and hours. You know, there's a massive degree of quality education, experience, training, common sense that can be applied that too often these days isn't getting applied because we're being forced down checkbox routes. And I don't want to sound overly negative towards the tick box checklist stuff, because that has its place and it's really powerful. It's just we can't avoid the other human side of it.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it goes back to that mindset approach. It's about solving the right, understanding the problem you're solving, and then using the right tools to solve it. There's nothing wrong with measures and metrics, like they're critical, right? We've got to have them. Yeah. But if we go OTT, they cause more problems than they solve.
Yeah.
You know, there's some things that you can have loads and loads and loads. Like there's some, if you're making, to give an example, silicon chips, you need to have loads of measures and metrics about the cleanliness process, because otherwise your chips fail, because when you're building them, they get a tiny bit of dust inside them. So that needs to be really tightly regulated and scrutinized. And that's where you'd have sensible, appropriate, you know, measures and metrics, and lots of details and lots of counting around that particular scenario. Whereas, you know, if you're having a conversation with someone about their depression or their fears about an operation, you know, how many measures and metrics do you want to have around that? That's more of, it's an outcome that you're looking for, and you want to measure the outcome, but you don't need lots of detail around measuring the process. Yeah. So I think I completely agree with you. It's about having the right approach, the right mindset to support the team in solving a problem for a group of people.
Yeah, I think we are aligned from that conversation. Sorry, I've took us off track for a good 10 minutes there, but it felt really useful for me. And a quick one just to finish on that is, again, you need to be close to the patient to really understand what the outcome is that they want. Because as a clinician, you can assume that they want a knee operation because they've got a poorly knee. But actually, if you talk through the details, it might be that they won't be able to do much kneeling if they have their knee operation, and their raison d'etre is gardening. And it's getting close to the patient to really understand what they want as the outcome, as opposed to us assuming what they want. And the shared decision-making process has got to be good. And again, agreed. You've got to get to the patient for that.
Agreed. I think we've got a lot better at it over the last 20 years. There's still a ways to go. But you know, 40 years ago, we didn't really talk about patients' ideas, concerns, and expectations holistically and consistently. And now that's built in to a lot of the way that we can have our consultations. So I think we are getting better, but I think there's still a ways to go, especially with certain patient groups which are you know, difficult to include in our current medical model. I think there's a lot of work still to be done there.
Yeah, brilliant. So moving us on then, who's inspired you throughout your career in the public service, and what characteristics have they had that you think's been the difference for them to be a cut above the rest of us?
Oh, there's been lots of inspiring characters, and the ones that I will mention now will be not it's just because I'm mentioning one or two now, it doesn't mean that there are not many others. So I want to mention someone as a chap. He's a thoracic surgeon at the Brompton Hospital. He's a chap called Mr. Eric Lynn. And I spent 3 weeks with him, not that long, towards the end of my medical school training. And I was having a conversation with him towards the end. He was a very inspiring guy to watch operate. I mean, he was just doing these incredible operations. And also I have a huge amount of time and respect for the way that he thinks and gathers data and bases his practice off of evidence. He's been doing things for the last 20 years around the improvement of the way that we as a profession do basically do thoracic operations for lung cancer. He's done a huge amount of work in the area. But what he said to me, so at the end of my 3 weeks with him, I said to him, Mr. Lim, I want to be a really, really good doctor. What do I do? And he turned around and he said to me, and I thought he was going to say, John, you've got to work really, really hard. You've got to understand all the knowledge. You've got to, be up until 3 a.m. every single night, really understanding all of the detail and, practicing, getting all of your technical skills really down. And so what he says was, John, it doesn't matter how much you know, unless the patient has understood and is engaged with you on the journey, you won't be able to support them in having a good operation and a good outcome. So the key is the conversation you have with your patient. And that stuck with me ever since. And the reason that it stuck with me is because what I understood is that I have to know lots. I have to be technically competent. But what is the outcome that we're looking for? And the outcome is a healthy patient in the round. It's not about just chopping out their cancer. It's not about just
it's the human. It's the human element, the human interaction, and getting the other human in this scenario to behaviour change.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And for a very, very, very technically gifted individual to be saying that, it made me think a lot about my practice. And since then, I've tried really, really hard. You can't always succeed with every patient, but I've always tried really hard, not with every patient, but with every colleague, to try and support them in getting them the outcome that they want or need. So I think that although short experience with Mr. Eric Lim had a profound impact, and there was another gentleman called Mr. Aslam, who was a surgeon in my first ever job as a sort of house officer as a doctor. And what I remember from Mr. Aslam was his dedication to the patients. He was always the first person there. He would be the last person there as long as is needed. And he went around and saw all of his patients twice a day, every day, whenever they were having an operation or having something done for them.
Yeah.
And I remember that dedication, and I've tried to model that as much as possible throughout my career, because what it gave you was a constant feeling for not just your practice and how you were practicing and what the impact of your actions did for that particular patient over a period of time, but also going back to the spirit of public service of who you're doing this for. You're not just doing this you're not just doing this as a sort of a 9 to 5. You're doing this for someone. You're going to have impact on someone throughout their life, and you've got to support them at this. You've got to take responsibility for your actions for that individual and support them throughout their journey, their health and health journey. So, I mean, these are two people. As you can tell, they had a similar. They were involved in my practice at quite a seminal point, sort of going out of medical school into clinical practice. There are so many more that I have that helped me be the person, or help cause me to think about the person I am today and try to be a sensible person today. But
both those stories absolutely tying into focus on the patient nicely.
Well, they focus on the patient. What's so interesting, though, in the work that I do now is that, and this is what I still struggle with, is that I want the best outcomes for every individual. But when you look at things in a system, sometimes decisions have trade-offs, right? Every decision has trade-offs. So what I want for everyone is for the best possible outcome all the time, but that's not possible. So sometimes, especially with the transformation work we're doing now, you're trying to get the best outcome for everybody, but in an environment of limited resources. And we are in an environment of limited resources right now. Not every decision is going to improve outcomes for every single person. And that I find really tough. And I don't have good answers for that. What I have had is conversations with very senior colleagues in the NHS where we've talked about these issues and how we can't get the right outcome for everyone all the time. But what we need to do is in a time where we have constrained resources, make sure that we do the best that we can with the resources that we have, which is a tough situation to be in. And I think it's one that we will be in as society for the coming years, unless the promises that we see with AI truly come to the fore, in which case then it'll be a very different situation.
Yeah. My belief is, just to test with you, is that there's a lot of things that we do because we're overwhelmed. We can get into a firefighting position quite easily, and that stops us from taking that step back and just seeing the wood for the trees. And I think in that overwhelmed scenario, what happens is, John Seddon's written a book called Freedom from Command and Control. And he's done a lot of work and a lot of research, and he believes there can be up to 80% worth of waste because we're not getting enough right first time. So back to my little story earlier on, the amount of work that went through the system because I didn't have the extra 5 minutes of, I was sent off on a COPD pathway. Don't smoke, exercise all the time. If he'd spent an extra 5 minutes with me, I do not believe I'd be referred off onto a COPD referral pathway. And then that wasn't the case. And then it was something else. It was airways and sinus scans and all sorts of stuff. That created a massive amount of work in the system, huge amount of work. So I think there's still a lot of scope for us doing that right.
I completely agree with you. And I was having a conversation actually with an ENT surgeon who works in Sunderland, who's just finished. He's just soon to retire. And Errol was telling me about a dizziness pathway that he developed. And the dizziness pathway was exactly this. You didn't have a 15-minute appointment with someone, so classic sort of, or half an hour appointment with an ENT surgeon. You had a full hour. And it went through in really, really, really tangible detail, all different, in that first consultation, all of the different factors that could be contributing to your dizziness. And he said, by having this one very holistic conversation, really understanding the symptom and the patient and the needs, you were then able to get them on the right course, right pathway, and stop having all of the unnecessary scans and the repeated appointments back and forth with multiple different clinicians. It was one-stop shop that tried to do everything that you need to do for that given patient, that given symptom. And I couldn't agree with you more, Anthony, about the need to treat people holistically. If you get it right at the beginning, it can make a massive, massive difference. The problem that we have right now is that demand is really, really, really high.
Yeah. And I think we need to stop something, don't we? Another very quick story. I used to work at Air Tours years ago. First job as I was qualifying to be a management accountant. And I had to get up at 5:30 to get in the office for 6:30 to get the board report to them for 12. And it was killing me because I was studying at the same time. It was awful. So basically interviewed the directors and found out that 40% of the report they never read. And it's just like, you assume that it's the board of directors, they're gods, they must want this stuff. It's been the same for 10 years. And it's like, the stuff we can stop. Honestly, there is. It doesn't matter which environment we're in. And a lot of it, I think, will be metrics that get reported that actually aren't adding much value and or aren't getting read at all. I think there'll be a lot of scope for that. And the other big one for me is meetings, massively improving meeting productivity and efficiency. Again, we can save a lot of time to give us that scope, take that step back and reconfigure what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think that's a big part of what we need to do.
Yeah, agreed. I think meeting hygiene is something that's, there's certain things that you kind of wish you were taught at primary school. And I mean, do you really ever wish you were taught at primary school about meeting hygiene? But one of the things we might want to consider is getting these habits in early, right? So you have a meeting, it's focused, it's to the point, everyone knows why they're there, what we're trying to achieve, and crack on. And it's, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah. I could literally speak for hours with you on all this stuff, but I know you've got a busy day ahead still. what recommendations would you make for people joining the public sector now, and sort of an oversight of recommendations that you'd give them? And is there any research that you'd get them to read, any articles or books or anything like that? A double hit question, this one.
For anyone who is ever to go into medicine or health and care, this is a relatively timeless book, but it's called House of God.
Okay, not heard of that.
It's interesting because it was written in the late 70s, and it's still so pertinent today. The chap who read it actually ended up, who wrote it, wrote it to describe his junior years of being a doctor, and he ended up becoming a psychiatrist, because I think by taking from one of the forwards that I read, he wrote sort of in hindsight, having wrote the book and then 10 years later wrote sort of a forward for a second edition or whatever, was that you could, helping people's mental health and trying to support them with any psychiatric issues, there was a lot to be done there. There was a lot of gaps that we have there professionally in the medical profession. I agree, we still do.
Yeah.
I think but the reason I'd say that book for anyone is that it gives you an insight into what happens when the metrics are wrong.
Yeah, okay.
And what the dynamics are created when the metrics aren't right and the behaviors that are exhibited.
Yeah.
And you don't see it when you read it the first time. You have to go back and read it again after you've been in the sector for 5 years, then again in the sector for 10 or 15 years. And what happens is that you can see, oh, right, this behavior, why is this person talking like this? Why is this behavior being exhibited? And you get quite, the language that's used is not nice language, but you can see that a person is what the environment does to the individual, and how it's not actually a productive or a pleasant place to be.
Yeah.
But it's a book that there's a lot that can be learned from reading that book, especially over a career, and reflecting back on what is the system that we are actually creating for people, and how can it take these really bright, enthusiastic, good, strong individuals and get them into a place which isn't necessarily the most healthy place for them to be, not for them nor for their patients. And so I'd say House of God is actually a good book to read, because it takes you, it's written in an era that's very different to where we are now, but the principles and the demonstration of what happens to people if the measures and metrics aren't right, and the culture and behaviors that surround the delivery of care aren't what they need to be.
Okay, I'm definitely going to get that one. That sounds absolutely perfect for the work that I'm looking to expand on. No, really good. Can you remember the author?
Samuel Shem, Samuel Shem.
Great. Okay, fantastic. And then, so just to finish off then, we've got a lot of pressure in the system, and Keir Starmer's calling about reform or die. So a lot of people can sort of see the NHS as quite a negative place to be at the moment. Retention problems, etc., recruitment problems. Where's the hope for you? Are you still optimistic and hopeful?
So I'm very much a glass half full kind of individual. I was really worried up until about 6 to 9 months ago, because what I see is demand rising, the available workforce reducing. And so if you look at it from a population basis, you know how there's population pyramids, which are like this, which we as a country were 80 years ago, we're now very much like this. And so therefore what that means is that you have fewer people here who are able to care for the people who are sort of older in the population pyramid. And people are living longer with more complex medical conditions now. And even since I was at medical school, like a colleague of mine said it really well. She said, I started out as an anaesthetist in the late 80s. He's just about to retire. Said, if you had a fractured neck or femur, so broken hip bone, and you were over the age of 65, you almost certainly would not get an operation.
Yeah.
A month ago, I did an operation on a 100-year-old for a fractured neck of femur.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example of the change and the pressures.
30 years ago, we just simply didn't do stuff for people.
Yeah.
Because we couldn't, for a range of reasons. The kit wasn't there, the systems weren't there. It was just, okay, this is the way it is. Now we do lots for lots of people. That's great.
Yeah.
But the demand is,
The pressure.
the demand is really high. And so my view was, I was really worried, because if you look at that picture globally, something's got to give, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm seeing with the AI stuff coming through, the technology, is the potential for huge gains there. Now, we could spend at least an hour on AI, if not more. But the challenge we're going to have with AI is it being used well?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that is just, I think 6 months ago, a year ago, a bit despondent. Now, with what we're seeing with AI coming through, I think it'll be a huge time saving and time release for lots of people. And so from a health and social care perspective, it should free up time to care, so that we can do a lot of the basics well, and the more complicated stuff well too.
Yeah.
But it's going to have to be managed well.
I agree with you 100% in terms of the AI. I think there's loads of potential, and I also agree that it's got to be managed really carefully. I don't know if when we met that I talked to you about the work I'm doing on Insight Genie, but my vision is that we can use it. You mentioned several areas we can use it. My big driving force is decision making and getting the decisions made right first time, and being able to engage with more stakeholders than we normally do, so that we can get those decisions made right first time, improve meetings, and really, I think we can exponentially improve productivity with AI in that way. But I agree, we've got to be careful with how we use it.
Completely agree.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And it'd be nice for us to do some work on that as well, with your work down the line. That'd be fantastic. We're out of time, John, but thank you so much for your time and effort. I've really enjoyed it. It's one of those meetings where it just flies by and it feels like I need another 2 or 3 hours, but I'm sure we'll be doing more in the future, and really looking forward to working with you. I know that you're doing some really exciting stuff. So thanks again. And if you can keep in mind anybody that you know and on your travels that you think might be a perfect person to get involved and do another episode, then please let me know.
Brilliant. No, actually, it's been an absolute pleasure. And it's just nice to talk with kindred spirits about how we can think differently about how we can improve people's lives. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.